When I suddenly woke up at midnight, I felt something uneasy. The air under the mattress smelled like old smoke and something metallic. A wet, shallow breathing scraped against the bottom slats, slow and deliberate, as if whoever was there was timing my breaths. My phone screen flashed 2:07 a.m. and the battery icon was red. For a long suspended second, I imagined a dream. Then the breathing moved once, a wet, almost human hiccup, and the world snapped back to a clarity I couldn't deny. I had booked the place because it looked safe in the photos: pine floors, a gas fireplace, a terraced backyard that hugged the tree line. I'd driven 3 hours to escape the city for a weekend of writing, and not so secretly avoiding a messy breakup. The host profile was perfect. Pictures of a smiling older woman. Dozens of 5-star reviews praising the quiet. She texted a code and a warning: "No shoes inside, please. There's a raccoon that likes the porch at night." The door had a keypad. I punched in the numbers and it clicked open like every other vacation rental I'd used. At first, everything felt normal. I unpacked, made coffee, sat at the window, and wrote until my eyes hurt. The house was charming in a disjointed, thrift store way: old armchairs, framed postcards, a dusty grandfather clock that never rang. There was a spare room with a single bed I used as an office for the weekend. I remember turning off the main lights before bed and thinking about the way the house settled, the way wooden floors exhaled after a hot day. I locked the front door. I was careful about that. I always am. Sometime after midnight I woke to a distant rattling, something sliding across the kitchen tile. I dismissed it as wind catching a loose gutter. The clocks in the house were wrong. They were either stopped or set to weird times. I checked my phone, turned it off again, and rolled over. My suitcase I had left on the floor near the bed was closed. I must have dreamed the sound. At 1:40 a.m. the bedroom door clicked softly once and the house took on the tight focus of danger. It was the kind of noise that belongs to other people's nightmares. The sound of a knob that tests its way, gently, methodically. The knob didn't jiggle, it didn't slam. It turned with care, with patient calculation. I sat up and listened. Then the breathing began, nearer than before, like someone standing at the foot of my bed, inhaling against the quilt. I told myself to call 911, but my mouth dried up. The phone was across the room on the bedside table, under a lamp, the corded charger trailing like a lifeline. To walk to it would be to announce my movement. If there was an intruder, they'd hear me. If there wasn't, I would wake someone sleeping. I pictured a man in a hoodie, a knife, a face I would never unsee. I imagined my own voice breaking when I called for help. I did the only thing my swirling panic allowed. I pulled the blanket up to my throat and stared at the darkness between my knees and the bed frame. That's when I heard the scrape, the unmistakable sound of a neon wood, and a whisper so faint, I almost convinced myself it was the house. Shh. I don't know how long I held my breath. Breath became a currency I hoarded. The noise moved, under the other bed, toward the door, then away, like a tide. A shadow slid beneath the curtains in the window. Small evidence of a silhouette exploring the outer house. Once a set of keys chimed somewhere near the kitchen, a jangling like a man testing doors as he moved through rooms he knew. I realized then that whoever was here didn't think they were intruding. They were looking for something. Or someone. The first raw thought was call. The second was scream. The third, more rational and colder, was if he notices me, I will use the room as a trap. I had lived alone for years. I had a stubborn streak I didn't love but relied on. I crawled, slow and pliant, to the suitcase and grabbed my charger. My hands were a mess, clammy, clumsy. So I dropped it and fumbled until the phone hummed to life. My hand hovered over the screen and my whole body screamed that the screen's glow would give me away. I dialed 911 on speaker so the call would be visible to me, and the operator would hear anything he said. 911, what's your emergency? The voice asked, neutral and trained. There's someone in my Airbnb. I whispered. The words were ridiculous, domestic, somehow embarrassing. My knees were in the hall now. The floor was a blade against my skin. I directed the operator to the rental address using my guidebook, whispering until my throat burned. The footsteps were deliberate and close. They passed the bedroom door with the kind of slow, assured motion of someone who had done this before. They stopped in the hallway. I could see the shadow of a wide shoulder thrown through the slats of the blinds by the streetlight. The man looked at the framed pictures on the wall, almost reverent, the way someone studies trophies. He was not hurried. You alone? A voice asked, low and casual, like a man having a neighborly argument. My throat closed, I said nothing. The operator told me to stay on the line, and her words were a warm net. I whispered facts about myself. The intruder called someone on the phone. I caught snatches. Yeah, she's in the back room. No, don't worry, it's clean. The word clean stuck in my mind like a splinter. He moved with the pattern of someone who knew the house. He went directly to the closet, the drawers, the safe tucked under the false bottom of a dresser I hadn't thought of hiding mine in. He opened cabinets, read labels like an old script. He muttered to someone who was not there. For 10 minutes he searched the kitchen, his hands resting casually on the counter, fingers tracing the rim of a coffee mug, as if rehearsing gestures beneath other people's lives. He came to my bedroom and paused. He crouched briefly at the foot of the bed and hummed. He touched the quilt, the way a thief might test for the weight of a sleeping body. Then he moved away, as if deciding I wasn't the prize. An hour later the footsteps receded, and the house fell into a jagged, stunned quiet. The operator told me officers were on their way, and I could unfreeze. I waited with my phone pressed to my ear, and my other hand on my chest, feeling the hollow under the sternum where fear lived. I pictured them finding the intruder and trapping him in a blue light like a net. I pictured the relief. It didn't come. When the door clicked and the police came, the officers were polite but fidgety. Their flashlights painted the walls, and the house that had seemed intimate now felt like a staged tableau. They found prints on the counters, a pair of worn sneakers tucked under the porch, the front door propped open with a rock. The officers called the host, who said she had installed a smart lock that recorded entries and sends alerts. There were none for tonight. The key code hadn't been used. The house had no signs of forced entry. Squatters sometimes live in vacant properties next door, one officer said. He suggested the intruder might have a key. I had no key. I had a code. We checked upstairs. In the closet above the garage they found a makeshift sleeping bag, a small shrine of sorts, photographs of the property, torn Polaroids of the house, an old rent receipt stamped with an earlier year. Someone had been living in the neighborhood, cataloging the houses. That revelation was supposed to be reassuring, a logical explanation. But when they lifted the mattress in the living room, they found the trace that made my skin crawl, a row of small indentations along the slat, like someone had pressed their fingernails into the wood. And beneath the bed, wrapped in a tarp, lay a small journal, its pages filled with notes about guests, times and names, the kind of stalker's ledger you see in films. Only this was real, in my hands. They put it in an evidence bag. The officer's face went slack reading a page. He looked up at me with a tired level of sympathy that said he'd seen this before. We've had complaints, he admitted. A man who calls himself the cleaner. He watches for households lock up and then lets guards down. He's smart. He reads calendars. We left, me in a uniformed car with windows up, the house behind us a tidy silhouette against the streetlight. For 3 nights I stayed at my sister's place and slept with the lights on. My writing suffered. I replayed every small decision, leaving the window slightly ajar to air the room, using headphones in the living room while forgetting to close the bedroom door, locking the front but not the back. A week later I went back to the journal. The police had traced the owner to a narrow house 3 blocks away and arrested a man with multiple keys. He had an arsenal of burglary tools and a string of victims. In court he told a story about wanting to fix houses. He said he would hide sometimes to watch how people lived. He didn't cry when the judge read the account. He didn't flinch. His eyes were calm. Months later, sometimes in the middle of the day, I catch myself lying on my back and listening. A habit of scanning for the wrong breath lives in my lungs now. My new apartment's bed has a box spring that sits too high. I sleep with a chair wedged against the door. The world teaches you how to be careful, but it doesn't teach you how not to feel marked. I still write. I still take trips. I still open strangers' doors. The difference is, when I sleep, I picture the shape that could be under my bed and count my breaths until they're boring and even. Sometimes I think about the phrase he used. It's clean. He meant he leaves no mess. He meant he takes only what others don't want you to know he's taken. Your sense of safety. I can't prove that anything other than property was lost, but the quiet gulf he left inside me was the most valuable thing he ever stole. And sometimes, in a dark hotel room, when a shadow slides under the curtains, I know exactly what that slow, wet breathing could sound like. At 3:14 a.m. a man walked past the bedroom window. His footsteps were soft, too soft for gravel, and too precise for someone walking freely across the street. He moved like a shadow pinned to the sidewalk, steady, rehearsed, as if someone were dragging an invisible puppet. I remember the timestamp, because I checked the phone immediately and then, because I couldn't help myself, filmed him on the edge of the screen. When I played back the footage the next morning, the man's face didn't move. His eyelids didn't blink. His lips didn't shift. He had the shape of a person, the contour of ears and nose, but no small betrayals of life. No breath fogging against the window, nothing to indicate eyes moving beneath skin. It was like watching a wax figure rehearse walking through a dream. I had chosen the apartment because of a rumor I love, old things that retain stories. The place was a converted turn-of-the-century boarding house, 3 floors of narrow stairs and narrow mines. The listing was honest, historic building, thin walls, quiet neighbors. That meant I expected creaks, a neighbor late for work, muffled TV sounds. It did not mean a procession of impossibilities outside my window while I counted my teeth. It did not mean the photos in the hallway that recorded decades like a timeline from smoke-colored past. The host, Elinor, was a retired archivist who ran the place like a museum. She loved to chat about the house's history, a ward of wartime nurses, a jazz singer who lived on the 2nd floor, a milkman whose hat was preserved in a drawer. She gave me a paper brochure of the building's past, and a brass key that almost fit the lock. She warned me the heater clanked, and that the upstairs neighbor liked to play piano late. All charming, all human. She smiled at the door and said, "The building remembers." Night 1 was the usual quiet pacing of old radiators, the smell of lemon polish in the stairwell. I woke at 2-ish to the soft patter of rain and drifted back to sleep thinking of nothing. At precisely 30:14 the figure passed the window. He left no footprints in the wet street. He didn't react to a passing dog or a car. He didn't glance at the lit store across the road. He just walked, focused like someone on a date with a memory. From the window I watched the lack of expression, the jaw that never shifted. I filmed because in 2025 you film absurd things. When daylight came, I slapped the footage to several friends in an online forum. People guessed mannequin, prank, AI trick. Someone suggested I had filmed a reflection. None of these possibilities fit the other evidences unfurling that week. On day 2 I found a scrap of paper pinned under the fridge magnet, a note scratched on coffee-stained paper with one line in a child's looping hand. "He walks the same path every night." I asked Eleanor. She looked at the note like a delicate thing she'd almost forgotten. She said, "That's from Mrs. Halpern. She lived here in the 70s. She saw things sometimes." She shrugged and handed me a tray of cookies and a story about Mr. Avery who used to walk every night, dutifully, around the block. Curiosity turned into a quiet obsession. I started leaving the window cracked at night, hoping to catch the man again. The second night at 30:14 he walked by, same steps, same sagging hat, same unmoving face. I filmed him again and the footage showed nothing anomalous, just the silhouette of a man. Yet in the raw material my hands had felt something like a pulse under the skin of the image, an old energy I couldn't name. I knocked on my upstairs neighbor's door. Her name was Mara. She was friendly and a little afraid of the dark too. She said she'd lived in the building for 16 years and had never seen anyone like that. Then she told me to look at the basement archive old tenant logs, a ledger of names and dates that read like a cemetery map. As I paged through the brittle sheets I stopped cold. There, faded in a clumsy typewriter, was my building's address, and then a list of people attributed not to living but to departed. Mr. Avery's name appeared, and beside it a year I recognized from Eleanor's story. The years a man had disappeared from headlines, a man who used to walk every night before a small scandal. Later, in a box of newspaper clippings, I found a photograph taken from across the street 20 years ago. The print was grainy, but the posture was identical to the man I'd filmed. People had circled the photo in red ink and written, in a legalistic hand, "Sightings reported. Unexplained." The photograph was captioned, "Local residents report repetitive night walking near Wren Street boarding house." Subject described as emotionless. That afternoon I found a door with a brass placard in the basement. Memory room. Inside were trunks and trunks of items. Gloves, hats, postcards, a small music box that still played a warped tune. A volunteer at the Historical Society told me that, according to oral history, after a series of small tragedies in the neighborhood, a man named Avery became a fixture. He had been a doorman once, a watchman, someone who noticed comings and goings. When a fire took a life and the city moved on, they said he would be seen walking. Always same path, always same slow gait. Older neighbors had left notes clipped to his route. "You don't have to walk it any alone." He had kept walking anyway. At 30:14 on the third night he changed. He paused outside the building and bent his head toward the window. For the first time his face shifted. Not by muscle but by absence. Features smooth like clay pressed too hard. His eyes did not move, but his head angled toward me. I felt, Absurdly, seen. Then he continued down the street and vanished into the downpour like a photograph dissolving. I told myself I was making ghosts of newspaper clippings and long-term city myths. I held theories people like routine. There are odd behaviors in every city. But then my phone pinged an email from the host with a photograph attached. It was an old black and white picture of the building, taken in the 1940s. On the stoop, a young woman sat with a child on her knee. There was a faint blur at the edge of the image, like a smear, and in the margin a note read, "He always walks. He watches without memory." It felt less like a note and more like a plea. On the last night, feeling ridiculous and stubborn, I sat by the window with my recorder and a cup of too strong tea. At 3:42 the man walked by. As always, I didn't film him. I watched him. He paused, looked up at the building, and then, impossibly, lifted a hand. The fingers were straight and wooden. He tapped twice on the glass, like someone asking permission to enter. The sound was 3 soft knocks. My hands shook so badly I missed the recording. He walked on. I left at dawn with a feeling lodged in my throat like something I had swallowed. I told myself I would not look back. Yet I visited the Historical Society again, flipped through another box, and found an old note. "If you ever see him stop, leave a candle." Someone had scrawled it in a sisterly, urgent hand. "He only remembers with light." I drove away with the memory of a face that didn't move in a city that kept its dead like pets on a leash, fed and walked but not mourned. A few months later I returned with a small candle and pressed it to the window on a rainy evening. The flame trembled and threw the shadow of my hand across the glass. Outside, the man walked his path and did not notice me. Inside, the candle made the world less sharp, softened the edges of memory. For that moment, the man's face seemed more human, as if light gave him the small concessions of being alive. When I left town, I took a photocopy of the ledger and a photograph of the man tapping the glass. I keep them in a drawer, and sometimes I look at that photocopy and think that maybe the city stores its memory in motion, not in static monuments. Maybe the man is the motion, the practice of never forgetting how the world moved when people still lived in it. Or maybe he is just a man who couldn't stop walking. Either way, if you ever stay in an old building and see a figure at night whose face does not move, don't film him. Don't make him an image that will be debated in comment threads. Light a candle. It may be the only thing that keeps him from tapping. If I'd locked my window, I wouldn't be telling you this. I can say that plainly because I know the precise moment my life split into before and after, the second I decided to leave the bedroom window cracked for a breeze. That is the smallest, most ordinary choice that snowballed into one of the longest nights I have ever known. The cabin's listing promised isolation and stars, an off-grid refuge from a 7-year urban marriage that had been unraveling while both of us pretended we weren't fraying. I went alone. The host was a man named Clint, a lean sort of guy who liked short sentences and long smiles. He left a handwritten note inside the fridge with instructions and the Wi-Fi password written in a neat block script. "Open windows at night for the breeze," it said. I remember that instruction because 3 nights later I would repeat it like a curse. The place felt safe, locked gate, gravel driveway, a porch light that clicked off at midnight. Yet something about being alone, in a house amid pines, always makes the mind skitter. I left the window in the bedroom cracked, because even with the heater on the woodsy smell stuck to the curtains, and I wanted the windows to breathe. If you've ever slept with a window cracked in a cabin, you know the sound, the whisper of trees, leaves rubbing like fingers. It feels harmless. Around 1:20 a.m. I woke to a faint scent I couldn't place, metal and wet earth, and the window was open a little wider. I told myself I'd left it that way. I told myself I was being paranoid. But then a small shadow crossed the curtain. At first I thought an animal, raccoon, deer. But the shadow had precision. It moved with internal purpose. Then a small, polite tap at the glass. I froze. The tap was not violent, not the wrestle of an intruder trying to force entry. It was shy. Someone was waiting for permission. Somewhere in the back of my head a rational voice said that maybe it was a neighbor checking for lost keys. My hands reached for the phone and found it dead. No battery, no light. I fumbled for the bedside lamp, and then I remembered leaving it on the kitchen counter so I'd have better light for the late night snack I intended. I did what many of us do in panic. I made a plan that was foolish and precise. I pulled on jeans, slipped my phone into my pocket, and opened the bedroom door slowly to peer down the dim hall. The house looked the same, jacket on the peg, shoes by the mat, painting crooked as it had been. The porch light outside still blinked at a polite distance. The window curtains flapped like a flag in a breeze I hadn't felt. I walked quietly to the side window in the living room and peered out. The yard was a slick black plain, the trees like a dark forest wall. There, near the edge of the porch, a man sat on the lawn, knees pulled to chest as if he were cold. He wore a hood and a denim jacket, and he had an old-fashioned camcorder resting across his knees. He did not look up when I tapped the glass from inside. He had the look of someone who had rehearsed sitting this way for a long time. At that moment the foolish logic snapped. He either had keys, or he had been watching for days, maybe weeks. He had learned the pattern: lights out at midnight, windows left cracked. He had probably mapped in the entry points. I could feel my choices like sharp ledges beneath my feet. I had two routes: confront him and risk a fight in the dark, or lock myself in a room and wait. I remembered that the host, Clint, lived in a small outbuilding behind the cabin, and that he'd said he'd be gone until Monday. I scraped together what decency told me go wake him. I grabbed my car keys and made my way outside, telling myself I would be calm and measured and tell him to leave. From the porch the lawn looked different. The man had moved. He was at the base of a tree across the yard, hands wrapped around a plastic container. When I called out, he turned very slowly and smiled like someone who had been waiting for me to step into a stage light. Up close, he smelled like old cigarettes and mint. His eyes were patient. "You shouldn't have your windows open," he said, like a neighbor offering advice. His voice was smooth. "I'll call the police." He shook his head. "No need. I just wanted to tell you a story." His hand brushed the camcorder. "People leave things in strange places. You know, I collect them." It should have been a harmless, weird, small-town interaction. But when he mentioned a date that I had written in my planner, an anniversary I had circled in a private, bruised way, my stomach dropped. He knew things about me. He knew the veneer of domestic life like a map. Panic met clarity and yielded a chilly plan. If he was watching, he had a pattern. He would move at night. He would find ways to be inside small cracks. I tried to reason maybe he'd filmed the area because he was making an art project. Maybe he was lonely. Maybe I was making monsters in the dark. The man's hands gestured toward the house as if offering a tour. I smiled because survival is sometimes performed like a polite face. I drove to Clint's outbuilding, the gravel singing under my tires, and found the door locked. No movement. My phone battery registered barely a sliver, barely enough to text, and when I sent a message to the hotline, it delivered but no response came back. Back at the cabin, the hooded man sat on the same porch step. He was closer now, as if our movement had been part of the choreography. "Can you leave?" I asked. He blinked, smiled. His teeth were clean and ordinary. "Not tonight," he said. "But you can make me comfortable." I don't know how to explain what it is to be watched by a person who looks like they are your neighbor, and also a predator. He walked a polite arc inside the house, like someone taking inventory. He touched photos, not to steal, but to learn the faces. He asked about the breakup in the tangle of detail one remembers only when they have studied someone's life. He knew my name, my sister's name, where I'd last signed my credit card. He had written notes. He stayed until dawn. He kept asking questions in the way of people who collect vulnerability. He left small things behind: a pressed leaf taped to a napkin, a Polaroid of the same porch we were standing on taken from the angle of the pines, and a note, "Until next time." I called the police. They canvassed, they took prints, they said they'd increase patrols. I stayed elsewhere. I moved. I changed numbers. Months later I learned, through a forum, a local group, that the man had been seen around multiple Airbnbs and rentals in towns up and down the coast. He had a pattern. He chose places where windows would be open, where the summer breeze was a tool. He would sit, sometimes film, sometimes wait to be invited in. People claimed he left small tokens, Polaroids in frames, dried flowers pressed beneath your couch. It felt sick because they were gifts that implied access. 2 years later I received a postcard with a photograph of the cabin's porch, taken in the afternoon, bright and ordinary. On the back, in a hand I recognized, 3 words: "Nice breeze tonight." My name and my sister's address were printed neatly in the corner. I never saw him again. I do not know if he meant the words as kindness or threat. Some days I think the worst thing he wanted was to be seen. Other days I wonder if he was mapping for someone else. The police listed him as a suspicious outsider, nothing more. I filed the postcard away and slipped it between pages of a cooking book. Sometimes I sleep in hotels now, windows bolted so tight I can feel the press of the air. Sometimes the feel of a cracked window is tempting, fresh night for the lungs, and I think of that porch light and the patient hands that touched my things as if they had been his all along. If I ever go back to that cabin, I will lock the windows and never open them for a breeze. That would have been enough. I've never told anyone this, but I think I killed someone. The sentence sits in my mouth like a stone. I did not mean to kill. I did not plan to. What I confess is a smaller, meaner truth. I chose convenience over curiosity. And, for a fragile moment, I believed that hiding would protect me as well as the stranger. I rented a studio in a rundown part of town for a week cheap, close to the transfer station where I worked nights. The listing was bare bones: a bed, a kitchenette, a parking spot. The reviews were polite, cozy, close to work. The host, Marcus, was in his 20s and had an antique charm about him, tolerant, distracted by hearts instead of tasks. He gave me a key and a smile and a joke about the cheap curtain rods. The second night a man rang late, tapping at the door like he'd mistaken my place for his own. I opened it a crack because I'm not a cruel person. He looked like someone who had flushed his life at a roulette table. A beard grown into seams, clothes that hung off him the way stories do when stretched thin. He asked for a place to warm up. The street was bitter, the wind like a bag slapping the alley. He smelled like whiskey and diesel. He said his name was Darren, and that he'd left his keys in a cab. He had a tremor in his fingers. Hospitality is a slippery memory. He was polite, apologetic, and I have always been the type to worry people into safety. I made coffee. I gave him a blanket since he shivered. He sat on the edge of the bed like someone practicing weight. His hands were white at the knuckles, and he asked for nothing except warmth. He was small in the door's light, as if life had been cut off from him. Then he told me a story of losing a friend to a sleeping pill, of losing a job, of a son he couldn't reach. He couched desperate requests in humor. I had the choice to offer shelter longer, to call a friend, to offer a number. Instead, I suggested the women's shelter 2 blocks away with a casualness I now cannot place. It was the wrong shelter. It was for families and closed at midnight. I knew this, but in the soft flinch of his story I made a lazy, cowardly choice. I left the door open a hair and told him the bus stop was 7 minutes that way. I thought a door open was kindness and an exit was enough. I watched him stumble into the night and then hunched in my living room, like someone who just let the train take a crying child. I closed the door and let my guilt dissolve into commodity. I had my bed, my keys, my life undisturbed. I convinced myself that he would be fine. I pictured him on a bench shaking off the night and walking to the right bus stop. I told myself the city had services. At 20:30 a.m. I woke up to a muffled commotion. The sound was nearly tender, like someone seizing someone else by the shoulders and crying. I flung on clothes and opened the door to see 2 men pull Darren into an alley like it was a rehearsal for rougher things. They looked like they belonged to the same shadowy chapter of the neighborhood. One in a leather jacket, the other taller with a camera slung like a weapon. When Darren saw me, he shouted a sound that contained both recognition and pariah-ed forlornness. "Please," he said, and the men turned, startled, offering a calculation in glances like currency. I called them. One of the men lied, said you were stirring. It was a front. I felt suddenly that I had invited everything that was going to happen because I had given him the path. I stood there, stupid and useless, as the leather-jacketed man pushed Darren back against the brick while the other man fished at his pockets. I left because I didn't know what else to do. I closed the door and called the non-emergency line and told them about 2 men being rough. An operator took note and said someone would be dispatched. I could hear the men arguing in the street, absorbing the noise like a sponge. 10 minutes stretched. At 20 the operator returned my call with a voice I would never forget. "Sir, calls are coming in about someone in distress nearby. Are you the caller? We will send units." I stayed on the stair landing, a foot in the hallway, and a conscience flaring like a cheap bulb. When I went downstairs again, the alley smelled like wet dirt and the city. The 2 men were gone. Darren was propped against the wall by the dumpster, trembling in a way that suggested more than fear. He looked like someone who could not take the heat of the world any longer. I reached for help, and he pushed away as if I were a blade. He crawled toward the curb like an animal trying to find its place. "Police," he whispered. "No cameras." I didn't notice the camera at first. There, mounted on the building's overhang, a small black lens like an eye. The taller man with the camera had indeed been taking footage. He had not been a mugger in the usual sense, but part of a small, desperate crew that filmed homeless men and then posted their suffering as voyeur content online, begging for donations or clout. I had walked into a performance, and Darren had been the unwilling star. I called for help and someone finally appeared. 2 officers who cited disturbance, and then seemed to decide that the man who'd been assaulted had simply been on drugs. They wrote a report on slow, professional strokes. They asked me for my name and how long I'd known Darren. I told them for 5 minutes. They asked for his ID. He had none. They took him to the hospital because that was the box the system puts people in, brief care, then back on the street. They didn't ask why he had been in my doorway. They didn't ask why the camera crew had assembled. That should have been the end of it. But on the 3rd day after that night, a message arrived at my email. The subject line: "Thanks for the cameo." Inside was a link to a video. I clicked because humans are curious in grotesque ways. The video was shaky, edited, with cheap music stitched over crying. There I was on a 17-second clip, the doorway as a stage, Darren the central figure, the leather-jacketed man narrating in a voice that made jokes out of bruises. The comment thread was worse. People speculated about Darren's past. Some offered help in the form of insults, others tagged local shelters. The uploader had put my building's address in the description. I called the site and the police and Marcus. Marcus apologized and said he hadn't known anything. He was angry and defensive. The clip was taken down, but not before it had been copied and shared. Someone recognized Darren and posted a follow-up claiming he had overdosed later that night under the bridge because he had nowhere to go and because the cameramen had spooked him into running into traffic. I did not know if that was true. And here is the part I have hidden away. I imagine versions of that night in which I didn't open the door. I imagine versions where I put him inside and called a cab. I play the film of my life over and over. An editor with malicious energy, slicing frames where my small choices ripple outward in merciless ways. I think of the cameramen and the way they turned suffering into content. I think of Darren's eyes, the way they implored me, and I own the moment I turned the world back at a distance. I never saw a report that confirmed the death. It would have been an easy thing to pin down if it had happened. Bodies are recorded in the city ledger. I did, however, find a funeral notice months later with a name similar to Darren's and a photo that was not of him, but of a man with a softer jaw, someone who looked as if life had treated him with less cruelty. The notice had a small line about memory, loved by none, remembered by some. I cut it out and stuck it in a book I rarely open. Sometimes at night I imagine knocking on doors and saying, "I'm sorry. I know apologies are not absolution. They are small, clumsy lights that can't fix everything. I have told therapists who listen and nod and write. I have practiced legal phrases and absolutions. They tell me that guilt is a messy, unwieldy thing that means you are human. They tell me to forgive myself slowly. Forgiveness is not the same as forgetting. If I have a confession, it's this: I did not mean to be an accomplice to harm, but my small choices, leaving the door open, not calling earlier, bent the night into a tighter shape where someone suffered. Whether or not I killed Darren is a question that sits in my chest like a cold coin. I cannot prove the end result. What I can prove is the change inside me. I sleep less easily in doorways. I have a stubbornness about helping now, and I find myself offering my spare room to strangers even if it's inconvenient. I will not let convenience win again. Maybe that is the only thing that matters now. The small things we do to be less cowardly in future moments. Maybe that is how we keep our hands from being instruments of harm. I say this not for absolution, but as confession. It is the only honest thing left.